first off, I was curious. Your singing, although melodic, is also kind of percussive in nature. It's like you lock in with the beat, with the bass drum sometimes. And I'm curious, are there ever times when you are choosing words because of their sounds as much as their meaning?
I try not to do that with actual word choice, but the way that I write songs is I'm kind of constantly churning out subject matter separate to music existing, and I won't actually build a framework around a song until there is like a rhythmic backbone to it. I love rhythm. I love like the ability to propel people with musical decisions, and being able to do that with voice is just fun for me. So I wouldn't say that I'm choosing words specifically because of the way that they bounce, but I'm also not writing the song until there's something to bounce along with. So ideally one kind of feeds the other.
Okay, but you're creating lyrics still kind of, or ideas ahead of time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, without sounding too contrived, like I'd love the songs to be about something. I think there's a lot of precedent for music that like sacrifices emotional heft to try and like fit neatly into like rhythmic boxes or to communicate something in like the best possible melodic way.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we're getting it right, but the goal is to try and not have to choose between those two things and instead do both at once.
Right. Okay. So in other words, there's kind of that old or kind of music industry school of thought, like, oh, you know, if it's an up-tempo thing, we got to keep it light and can't tackle heavy subject matter. Is that kind of what you're...
That's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
I think that it's also the kind of thing where like a lot of times people think that if a song hits, it doesn't necessarily matter what it is about per se. And then certain artists, the lyrics are the focus, and I just think that we don't necessarily need to be a band where like you come in lyric sheet first, but I would love you to, like, should you choose to engage with the lyrics, find something that amplifies the whole thing that we're about, rather than looking at the lyrics and being like, well, all right, well, at least they're still a dance band.
Yeah. And then, but you've also put up some videos of you guys doing acoustic versions of your tunes. And I'm curious, is that often how a song starts when it's initially being written?
Yes and no. We almost actively try and shake up how songs come into being. So sometimes it's us sitting at a laptop with the ability to use a bunch of digital instruments to start to build a track. Sometimes it's one guy with a guitar. Sometimes it comes together in the room with everybody playing their instruments relatively fleshed out. So I wouldn't say that that's like the way we do it. It's definitely a way we've done it in the past.
Okay. It seems to me, though, that writing songs is hard enough, you know, I mean, to get that special sauce, and yet you guys put in the extra added challenge of trying to not go down a way that you've done it before, or throw, you know, a little right turn on the drive?
Yeah, I guess I would frame it differently. In my head, it's more like inspiration can strike anywhere. And the easiest way to like find great songs is to try a bunch of different things and be like as prolific as possible in the creative process. Like I just, the way that I function, the way that I think we function is like, we're not precious to the point where like once a song is finished, it has to exist, has to be put out, has to be the way that we define ourselves. There's a teacher I grew up there's a teacher I knew at college that had a phrase that's kind of a truism, but like hit very hard when we were impressionable, which is that 90% of your work isn't your best 10%. And so for us, it's like, I don't have the like any sort of like rock solid faith that like this formula is the magic bullet. So I just want to try every possible formula and see like what yields things that feel true to us. And quite frankly, not only have different approaches both yielded things that we stand by and that we love, but the same formula won't necessarily work if you try it 3 times. It won't work all 3 times, even if it works the first. So we find that like a mentality where we are committed to our formula being a lack of formula has been the best for us.
Yeah. And the whole 90-10 thing that you were talking about also kind of speaks to the idea of, you know, I've heard you have to write a lot of bad songs before you write good songs, and so you have to kind of slog through the process, so to speak. I mean, when you're initially coming up, you know, I mean...
Yeah, I would say that it doesn't feel like a slog. I still, like, the good news is I fundamentally love what I do. I think we all do.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, like, in the moment of completing a song, you have the least objectivity about it. Like the song that I just finished is the song that I'm most proud of until the dust settles, and I can take a more like critical distance from the thing to just be like, okay, what was I actually trying to say? Did I actually say it? Does it feel good in the way that it was said? Like, it's hard to be honest with yourself about those things when you've just finished putting the work in. And you're like, if I say that this one's not the best one right now, I'm invalidating the last 6 hours of sweating over this thing. But if every day you get up and you try again, it all of a sudden becomes much easier to let a thing go and be like, this one wasn't perfect and this one is better. I can let this one go because we already beat it and we're trying to beat it every day.
Okay.
And I guess that's a bit more the way that it functions in my brain.
Okay. And then you, with your live shows, you talked about you have the goal of moments of, I want to get this right, ecstatic release. All right, so first off, is that both for the band and the audience that's the goal?
Yeah, I think that it wouldn't be possible to share the feeling if it wasn't stemming from us originally.
Okay.
I don't think you can short of actual substances, I don't think you can synthesize that kind of thing by just pushing it onto somebody else.
Yeah, but that's a lot to take on responsibility, it seems, to say, we're going to lift you up, and then to have a phrase like ecstatic release, which that's a high bar to try and, what do you guys do as a band to get people to that spot?
I'm going to start by saying it is the goal. We fail hard. We're willing to fail triumphantly. It's not like we have the pride to say this is definitely going to happen. Just that ideally what we'd love you to walk away from the show feeling is something like that. The way I think we go about it is I think that there are three things that immediately come to mind. I think most people don't have a rock steady internally motivated purpose for why they do things, and so to be able to attach to outside ideologies lets me grow and feel more complete and feel like real human. Something is happening. The other is a sense of community, where I think that people, whether acknowledged or not, there's sort of this unbridgeable gap that a lot of people seem to have, where it's we couldn't possibly actually get each other. Age difference, demographic difference, probably difference of passion, all of these things are going to prevent us from having this bonding moment. And I think that when there is something that a bunch of strangers can come together for the same reason over, and the people involved acknowledge that this is a space where these kind of meaningful connections can happen, you just get the chance to build something meaningful. I guess what I mean by ecstatic release can also come from a place of catharsis. I think that there is, of course, you're already happy and this makes you happier, but there's also you come into a space low and it brings you to slightly high, but the distance traveled makes it feel like you climbed a mountain. There's no wrong way to engage with the show once you enter the show. If you are here to have a good time and frankly get a little too drunk and try and respectfully take somebody home, that is a totally acceptable way, as long as you are good to the people around you, to experience a show. If you have just experienced recent heartache or trauma of any kind, and you are coming to the show to not talk to anybody and to just feel your own feelings and deal with them in a space, that is just as okay. Regardless of whether you think that we are party music or music to get through rough things, all we want to do is elevate the people that are coming into the space. And so for us, it's the positive judgment that whatever you came here to do is absolutely acceptable, and it's why we want you here. I don't want to be a band that just makes people burst into tears of catharsis or just makes people get drunk and have that kind of reckless good time. I would love to be a band that can connect the dots between those two people. Yeah.
And then you had another phrase that I saw in interviews where you talked about another goal being weighted joy, which I've never heard before, and I'm wondering if you can, kind of describe what you mean by weighted joy.
Sure. I guess kind of to what I was just talking about, I think that there's sort of a subtle, almost condescension around most happy emotions. I think that I, in my own life, have heard things that ignorance is bliss is a common idiom that people say, and a lot of people I know kind of trace a through line between a certain level of intelligence and a certain level of despondence at the state of the world. Once you know a certain amount, it's exponentially more difficult to find happiness of any meaning, because while we have a good time, the climate is being destroyed, the country either is or isn't going to hell, people are having fights at the dinner table. There are so many things that are categorically wrong as we try and have good times, that I feel like the party line is almost that like any moments of happiness are just distractions from the abyss.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's not like categorically false, but I do think that that's a path of least resistance. I think that in general, like, purpose is a human construct, and we decide what matters to us, and we decide what we focus on, and we decide whether problems that arise for us are insurmountable or not. There are some things that we cannot get past because they're just events, but in terms of how we react to it, how we build our joy, like, I think that there's a lot of things that can be done that are, like, on paper difficult, but allow these things to actually exist in a way where, like, you know, I would love to believe that there's a joy that can fight alienation, or a joy that can fight rage or hatred. And if we keep talking about these things as light and as sort of distractions, like, how would we ever do that? How could a distraction, like, actually solve the problem of feeling like you don't really connect with any human beings? Like, it needs to be on par with the, like, gravity of those negative feelings. And for me, I just don't have a better phrase yet than, like, weighted joy for it. Because heaviness seems to be the way that, like, more real emotions often get described, and I just don't really buy that.
Yeah, you get the image of Atlas with the weight of the world on his shoulder, and you know, and that kind of thing, and yet there's no equivalent imagery for joy. I'm
blanking on the actual book, but there's a book that focuses heavily on the story of Sisyphus, and at the end that kind of turns and says, like, one must imagine Sisyphus to be happy, and, like, basically saying that, like, even as he literally repeats an impossible task, he has been able to find and, like, derive his own meaning, purpose, joy from that task. Like, for me, that is the image that I, like, hold in my head when I have trouble, like, remembering why I do what I do.
All right, wow. I've never heard that interpretation of the whole.
I'm blanking on the name of the book, so I'd like to be 100% clear that that's not my idea, that is somebody else's thing, and I'm either stealing it or honoring it, whichever you choose.
There's the, it's a stereotype, but it comes from somewhere, of the madmen, the Madison Avenue people that are trying to distract you with bells and whistles, you know, to keep you from maybe looking at something a little bit deeper. And a lot of that is, you could argue, overly light. You know, it's saccharine and sweet and that kind of thing. But I would say, it sounds like what you're talking about is, with advertising agencies, they're trying to feed you some sort of joy and happiness that they've contrived on their own. You're talking about searching out your own and kind of, it's in your own hands and building your own joy, which is thus something a little bit more solid.
Yeah, and maybe, I guess the thought about Mad Men, what that triggers for me is, like, there's absolutely the mentality you're talking about with peddling product, but specifically with reference to music, if you look at where a lot of pop music's lyricism is sitting right now, it's kind of a sour mood. I mean, like, the even in songs that are upbeat, or even in songs that are meant to be, like, rocked out to, like, Post Malone is the first person to come to mind. Like, most of his music is not taking a positive worldview. Most of his music is peddling, like, a surface level sadness, alienation, and, like, feeling of being misunderstood. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of Better Now right now. And I think that, you know, while, like, advertisers may, like, work a certain amount of magic, like, people eventually, like, elevate the art that they think represents either their, like, how their world actually is or how they would like their world to be. And I think that seeing, like, kind of more darkness present itself in both pop tones and pop lyricism, I think that there is, like, a, like, difficult to articulate, like, at the root of how a lot of people are feeling, and it's not just one generation, it's not just one type of person. But I think that, like, at least in the art that I take in, like, there is this sort of inarticulatable, like, darkness feels like a weird and, like, cheap word for it, but I have no better one right now. But, like, this heart, like, tough to talk about darkness and, like, emptiness at the bottom of everything. And I think it's just like, okay, so everybody is just not really talking about that and expecting something to change, and it isn't. So I'm not going to say that this is absolutely the way, but what if we started to talk about it like it was a real thing, and, like, you know, like, there is happiness out there, but it needs to acknowledge that, like, life is shit wall to wall sometimes in order to actually have any hope of getting there. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this thing. I might.
Yeah. No.
Okay, cool. No, I think that it's kind of to your point, like it's not about, like what we do is not like the salve and the panacea for this darkness that we're talking about.
Yeah.
What we hope it is a process that lets you like develop your own medicine. Like I don't think that like anybody should come to our show because it's the only way that they can be healed, but come to our show because like we want everybody to find their own way to heal, and like we can just be a space where you can try stuff out.
Yeah. And you had said you wanted to build a world. You want people to think of Ripe both in musical terms and non-musical terms. I'm curious, what do you mean by thinking of Ripe in non-musical terms?
I guess, and you know, I think of what we do as just this synthesis of a bunch of smarter people's ideas. Sorry, that's a bug. But I think that like what we are seeking to do with the music is not a thing that like 100% requires that musical moment to do. I hope that we get to be a catalyst to like affecting the way people look at the things around them and the way that they interact with them and how they affect a space by being in it and what they can do both for themselves and other people. And like my ideal would be to have people walk away from this show with things that last longer than the 90 minutes of what we do. And I don't think that like, I don't think there's a guarantee that that's going to happen, and I don't think that I even have a clear idea of like this is exactly how we make that work. But I think that trying to figure out that process sounds like a great way to spend my life.
No, I would agree. I would agree. And then to switch more toward the musical end of things.
Okay.
You know, you have a very distinctive voice. There's this cool, smoky quality to it, and it sounds very much beyond your years. I was curious, number one, is this something you shot for? Is this, it's the voice you always had, or, you know?
Definitely not the voice I always had. You can listen to the very first recordings of Ripe or on Spotify, the EP Produce the Juice. People actually ask who the real singer of those songs was because it was me when I had more of a choir boy voice. I definitely smoked a little bit too much weed in college. I'm sorry, Mom. Mom. But it wasn't something that I set out to do. Looking back, a lot of my favorite singers are singers that are like more evocative than like technically good, and I came from a background of a lot of classical training, so like this wasn't a conscious move on my end, but I do like the fact that like in my head what my voice is able to do is like fulfill itself to a high ability. Like what I want to do now is just sound like me, which is a very exciting thing to have the prospect of doing, rather than sounding like, you know, an educator's idea of an educator's idea of a good operatic tenor.
Right.
And I think that, you know, I don't know, like it wasn't by design. I wasn't like, I want this kind of rasp, but Dave Matthews was one of the reasons that I started writing my own songs, and that guy has a raspy voice, and my dad has a raspy speaking voice. And I think that like, regardless of whether it was an active choice or not, like it was a tendency that wound up just getting like built.
Right. Okay. And then along with the idea of an educator's idea of what a voice should be like, you guys formed while you were students at Berklee. And I'm always curious for bands that have come from that kind of formal training, how have you evolved since leaving the school environment as a band?
So we were not all good students. Some of us were. I was kind of the middle line, and some people were below me, some people were above me in terms of how much we cared about the schooling as schooling.
Yeah.
There was a thing though that I will give Berklee credit for. This was a teacher that said this to me, where it's like, what we can do is provide you facility. We cannot provide you with inspiration. We can't tell you the what about what you do, but once you've nailed that down, we can give you 100 million ways to let that out, and like you can then decide which is the best way to do the thing that you're actually setting out to do. And I think that we've been very lucky that initially musically, and now we're trying to make it more like 360 degrees. Like we've always had somewhat of a clear idea of what we were going after.
Yeah.
So Berklee, for me at least, felt much more like infinite like possibilities, knowing that this was the path we wanted to cut. Here are just a ton of options for things that might work. And you know, the things that I took away from Berklee range from like lessons that were totally extracurricular, learned in a slam poetry class, to like Afro-Cuban percussion classes that like completely changed the way that I look at rhythm. Like it wasn't stuff that, you know, on paper would obviously line up with the path that we're trying to cut, but like I knew the things that I wanted, and these were things that warped the lens I look at everything with, which couldn't help but affect that, my life's pursuit the way that it has.
Which is kind of funny because it goes against the stereotype, because you're saying basically that it was in the world of academia that you got a broader perspective on some things, on some elements of the music.
I'd say so. I think it is not easy, because I think that the goal or part of the goal of a college is to get its students to succeed, and what success means, if you don't have a very concrete understanding of what that means for you personally, tends to look like financial stability, or tends to look like the exterior metrics of success, like awards, accolades, etc. And I think that that is kind of the path that you will be guided along if you don't have any idea of what you actually want to do and what success actually looks like to you. And I think that we got very lucky in forming the band right as college was beginning, having that band be true to itself and also something that we could take to the proverbial mountaintop just was also one of the things that we were pursuing. And so when we were looking at classes, when we were looking with how we wanted to spend our time, we had this thing that was outside of academia that we knew, if it didn't serve that thing, it wasn't as important. And for me, that wound up guiding the way that I looked at most of my Berklee time. And because of that, some of the things that I took in that time have been super useful and have been things that I've held on to ever since. I do think that Berklee specifically, and maybe all colleges, if you don't come in with your guns that blazing, it's not necessarily guaranteed to do that for you. And while a lot of what I learned at Berklee served the band was very much not a Berklee entity. We were a band of Berklee students that was not making music that was what the college was teaching. But it's still responsible for me meeting the band and being the person I am today, so I'm down.
You've described the band on the whole as one complex, blissed out unit. To see you guys perform live, you get the blissed out aspect to it. How are you guys a complex unit?
The first thing that comes to mind is that I think there's a lot of juxtapositions in the way that we look at a lot of things within the seven of us, and I do think that the seven of us working the way that we do is an exercise in seven very different personalities, truly putting the success of the group organism above any individual desires most of the time. And obviously sometimes the whole unit needs to focus on one person, or people are just not at a place where they can surrender to the higher thing. But I think that in terms of, are we trying to make music that everybody can interact with, or are we trying to make challenging music? Both sides are represented in the band. Are we trying to be a band where our aesthetic matches what we do, or are we trying to be a band that is always comfortable in our own skins? Is the goal to make a bunch of money or be as true as possible? All of those things, and those are all oversimplifications, but in almost any binary that I can build, there are people within a 7-person unit that fall on either side of that equation, and put that disparity aside to do this collective thing. And I think that while the end result is ideally fun, ideally electric, and ideally motivating, I think that it comes out of a process that is not what people expect. I can at least say that there was a period where these people are now close friends, but I met them through shows, and 3 people in very quick succession said something to the effect of you guys really don't seem like you're like this when you're on stage. And I was like, well, we can't show all of it, there's a whole room inside here, and we have a keyhole to show you, so we point the keyhole in the right direction.
Okay, I get it. And then finally, you guys have been together since 2011. You released a couple of EPs, but it was only last year that you finally released a complete album. What drove that decision to hold off on trying to put out something kind of long form?
I think that we've always been of the mind, which might be old school, but also there's arguments for and against it in today's world, that albums are kind of mission statements. The reason that we finally felt we were ready to do an album is because we finally had a handle on, to the best of our ability, what Ripe was. And so building a long form thing could be a journey explaining that. And I think that there's no rush in 2019 to put out specifically long format things. And the only band I can think of that does it on like a prolific basis is King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and they do sort of the concept for each record, so they're able to work at that pace. But for me, it's more like when I want to help like define what right is in like a big step kind of way, that is a long form's job. And short of that, it's about, you know, keeping the process of creation going and like capturing that lightning in a bottle when it feels appropriate. And I think that you know, the next steps that we have is it's not going to be a long form release. We're still ironing out the details of exactly how it's going to look like, but it's almost certainly not going to be a full record. And that's because I think that we are still like growing at a like frantic enough rate that I want to be able to like take a second, take stock of the full 360-degree picture and like turn that into something that is like articulatable and digestible before I feel like absolutely hell-bent on doing another LP.
Okay. In other words, you want to sit with something, let it bake in for a little bit and get a mental handle on things before trying to put it back out in your own poetry?
That, I guess, yeah. I mean, the person that comes to mind is like, you know, and this is absolute hubris to make a comparison between me and this person, but like Michael Jackson's records, like they were not like pushed out at a rate where like they just had the songs so they went. I mean, these are all apocryphal stories, but reportedly Thriller had like literally hundreds of songs left on the cutting room floor because it wasn't the vision. And like each of his records as a result is like a total update in every like way that you can think about the music of who Michael Jackson was. And also gonna disclaim here, like I haven't yet seen the documentary, and I understand that his like talking about his legacy is super fraught, and I don't want to speak out of turn, and I don't know what I'm talking about on that front. But to me, like having, like the goal is to have that much evolution every time you like really step up to the plate for a record. And I think that, you know, having records that sound similar or having records that like yield diminishing returns simply for the sake of putting them out isn't the way that I want to do what we do.